Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. There's something in the news today that caught my attention, and I'm sure you saw it as well, that there's the plan to increase the number of troops in Europe. We don't have enough. We have 62,000 there now, and it doesn't cost that much, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. Someday it'll add up to a lot of money, but the Europeans seem to not complain too much. But this is something different. This is to put some troops closer to the Russian border, right on the Russian border, in the Baltic states and in Poland. And the theory is that Russia is an aggressor nation and they may invade Europe. And we have to have troops there to protect Europe. So they're suggesting now that they send in maybe 4,000 or 5,000, who knows how many, a couple brigades, into that area to stop Russian aggression. It sort of reminds me about the aggression of Saddam Hussein. I think we were stopping his aggression, but it turned out a little bit differently, the real reasons why we're there.
Yeah, this is the European Reassurance Initiative. That means we're going to reassure them that we'll keep paying for their defense. I think you should probably call it the Military Industrial Complex Reassurance Initiative, because it'll involve some 250 more tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, howitzers, 1,700 additional wheeled vehicles. Price tag only $3.4 billion for this extra little initiative. So a little present for our European friends.
Now, what was the number on there? That's 250 tanks. Now,
yeah.
That's important for the tank industry. But I can remember we had a vote back in the early 80s at the height of the Cold War, and we were always fighting the Soviets, so we had to have tanks, and there was an appropriation bill to come up for tanks. And I said, where are the Russians going to invade us? You know, I had this naive belief, you know, that defense is defense, that you defend the country. So where are they going to attack us with tanks? Are they going to come across the Bering Strait, come down through Alaska or something? So I was trying to make fun of the whole thing. But I guess if we ourselves are an aggressor nation, we have to go in and you know, be mischievous in these other countries. I guess you need tanks. But quite frankly, to defend this country, I don't think we need very many tanks. You know, the Cold War wasn't brought to a stalemate because we had more tanks than they did. So I think this is nonsense. I think it has nothing to do with our national security. I think it has nothing to do with Russia potentially invading Europe. What do you think the odds are that Russia tomorrow morning, you know, during the Cold War, and a couple times I woke up and there was an invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and the Russians were moving, the Soviets were moving. But what are the odds that we wake up tomorrow morning and all of a sudden find out, well, they just invaded Eastern Europe?
That's why I think the whole thing doesn't pass the laugh test. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, an additional 4,000 to 8,000, however many those troops, that will not be able to fight the Russian army if they decide to cross over. Everyone knows that, just like the tripwire in South Korea. There's no way to stop it with just a few thousand extra men. The other one, it is so preposterous, the idea that you're putting your troops on someone else's border because of their aggression, whereas moving your troops is not an aggressive act. Putting a tank, you know, they had a NATO exercise just a couple of football fields away from the actual Russian border last summer. So the idea, and someone on Twitter the other day put an interesting couple of articles up from The Guardian. It's a British paper that's very anti-Russia, and it shows how whenever it talks about the Russian military, it says Russian aggression, but it described this move of U.S. troops, it's always deterrence.
Right,
you
right.
know?
But what would happen, though, if we ever had a president that was anti-Mexican, anti-Mexico, and was dealing with this, and the Mexican government went along with, hey, you know, you can't ever tell. Those Americans might be aggressors. They've aggressed against other nations. They may be coming in here. And so Russia says, oh, we'll help you out. We're going to put 5,000 troops, 10,000 troops on the U.S.-Mexican border, and we are going to stop the aggression because, you know, they're not talking very friendly these days. Isn't that a moral equivalent, at least? I mean, it's sort of ridiculous, but in a way, it's about as what we're complaining about in Europe right now.
Well, it doesn't sound so far off. There is a candidate who's been saying some things that have gotten the Mexicans pretty riled, so you know, maybe they'll turn to the Russians for some help.
Well, that's always possible. But I think this is obviously not good for the budget. I don't think it's good for our national security. I don't think it enhances the prestige of NATO because it's NATO, behind this. And of course, some people think NATO doesn't serve our interests. I certainly don't think it either. I've never been in. But it's more than just paying for it. If you can force people to pay for something, they're still doing the same thing. If Mexico had a lot of money and we could force them to pay some bills that we think they should pay, it doesn't solve the problem. So even in NATO, at one time I had the impression that we were being ripped off in the sense that we had nothing to say about NATO and United Nations. As the years went on, and maybe there was a transition where even if there's a token vote against United States to show an independence, it's really run by us because we have the money and we have the weapons. So they have no choice. So when we say, you better sign on the dotted line, we have to fight this NATO war in Afghanistan, or wherever, they have to go along with it. So who was the biggest cheerleader here is Breedlove, the general head of NATO, and he thought it was a fine idea to send more troops there.
Watch how quickly he gets a very well-paid job in the military-industrial complex when he's done.
Yeah, that will be the case.
I know you're not in favor of the idea of spending a bunch of money at home, but think about how preposterous. Europe is so wealthy that they can afford to invite 1 million refugees in and give them all welfare. But when it comes to taking care of their own defense, the U.S., with crumbling infrastructure, with students in more debt than they've ever been in their lives, with an economy completely in the tank, bankrupt country, somehow we can afford, talk about a ripoff, we can afford to provide them all the security they want.
Well, it looks like maybe some Europeans are waking up because they're sick and tired of what's happening to their country. Bad economics and bad foreign policy creates the migrants coming in. And some Americans are waking up too. Here, they're sick and tired of it, and it never hurt me to talk about bringing troops home and saving the money. And of course, my idea was leaving the money here and let it come into the marketplace, and people would be a lot better off. But with this effort, though, I think the odds aren't very good that they're going to quit this. But the American people, are starting to think that way. But then again, look at the candidates. Can you be weak on rebuilding the military? They're all for rebuilding the military. The one person that said wait a little bit on this is no longer a candidate, and of course that's Rand. But the rest of them, they can't be more hawkish and more spending money, and they're all dedicated to helping the poor, like you point out. What are we doing with them? And one of my positions, and I could be criticized for this, but if I could cut $10 billion out of foreign expenditures, put $5 billion to cut the deficit, and spend $5 billion trying to help people through a transition, the people who are totally dependent on government medicine, and help them out. You could have a transition. I never had the dream that would happen, but it's a theoretical way of doing it. But the American people aren't even ready for this. So all they have to do is hear one thing, and it's blown way out of proportion. I guess it was just yesterday or so, there were 16 people arrested that said, well, they look like they could be jihadists. It was Arizona or someplace there.
California, I think.
California. So that'll stir it up. So they are inclined not to listen to any logic at all on changing the foreign policy.
It's funny, even the one candidate who's built his entire campaign on giving away free stuff won't say where he's going to get the money. He won't say, well, I'm going to cut the military and give you guys all the free stuff. But the other thing, the other side of this whole issue is the idea of the justification, which is Russian aggression. And it's a word that's thrown up, it's a phrase that's thrown about constantly, but what is the Russian aggression? It was the U.S. that fomented the coup in Ukraine. It was the U.S. who backed the overthrow of the legitimate government there. And it's turned out as badly as the other U.S. regime changes like Libya and Syria and others. It's turned out badly, but it was the U.S. that you could argue was aggressive. We went thousands of miles away to try to change their government for them, And Crimea, they would say another thing. First of all, that's none of our business. I remember when that first happened, you wrote for USA Today an article something about who cares what flag flies over Crimea. But this is a little area that is majority Russian. It was part of Russia for hundreds of years. They had a referendum there. They decided to move back to Russia. What does it matter to us? Why does this justify billions of dollars? But I was thinking about, there is one place where Russia has been aggressive, and that's in Syria. As a matter of fact, just over the weekend, they were working with the Syrian troops to kick ISIS out of Palmyra. You know, so the one, and nobody said a word here in the U.S. about it.
And we didn't even cheer, did we?
And we didn't. Nobody cheered.
We didn't cheer. They were getting rid of ISIS for us. You know,
so
that's it.
This whole aggression thing it's something that they repeat. It's an empty slogan.
Yep, but they get away with it, and I think that we have to recognize the success of the propaganda machine. Most people didn't want to go to war, the Persian Gulf War or the Iraq War. They were against it, but their minds were changed because of how evil Saddam Hussein was. And he was an aggressor. He was about to invade other countries. He was such a danger. And so the people changed their mind. They used the word aggression and fear to build it up, and they will come here. Saddam Hussein was capable of launching a nuclear weapon, a weapon of mass destruction all the way over here. And there was nothing to it, but the people believed it because it was incessant by the politicians and the special interests, the military-industrial complex. They did it, and then the media never helps out, you know, in saying, hey, you know, what's the other side of this coin? Sometimes when the other side you know, expresses themselves, they can lose their job if they happen to be in the media. So that is a big problem, and we always keep hoping that there's an alternative to getting a message out, and we want to do our best to use the internet to get information out, because we're not going to get a job on the major media, and they're not going to all of a sudden say, you know, this is silly. This isn't even going to be in the news. This should be more spending and more accusations, and people already have been conditioned to really blame Russia for everything. Now, and our risk is, as soon as you say, you know, this is, look at this objectively, is, oh, you're un-American, America's at fault, and the Russians are good people and all. But it's a moral principle. What responsibility do we have? And then if we overstep, that it's not very practical. You know, if they could always argue, well, you guys didn't want to do it, but we went in and everything came out peaceful. But it hasn't worked that way. Just look at the Middle East. And they say, you know, we're more troops to the Middle East right now, more troops to Iraq, more troops on the Russian border. So it's hard to understand why somebody's antenna doesn't go up. But just think of the millions and millions of people, if you add them all up, to all the debates here in the past year, and they're still going on. But nobody really tries to change the people's opinion. Oh, you can't change people's opinion during campaign. You have to play. You have to play to their prejudices in order to get their vote. You know, if they have this position, we'll recognize it, and we're going to get votes that way. That's called coalition building. Well, we ought to have coalition building between progressives and libertarians on a pro-peace movement. That's the coalition I'd like.
Yeah, and you know, it's the other thing that's, you know, interesting. A lot of these countries that are going to have these troops stationed are economic basket cases. They've taken the bad advice of American Keynesians who went over there and told them how to redo their economy, and their economy is in the tank. So they're going to benefit from having these troops there. So there's a boon for these countries. The other thing, as you started out saying, the whole idea that Russia is going to come and invade Europe is so preposterous. The number one reason is trade. Although there are sanctions on Russia because of their aggression, I think Putin was in Hungary recently, and he signed a bunch of trade deals with the Hungarian Prime Minister. You notice Hungary's not getting any troops, so they're not going to get all the goodies. But they're building their trade relationships. They would like to trade more. The idea that you're going to invade instead of trade, or invade with those whom you trade, is silly.
Maybe the Hungarians have the right idea. You know, we'll stay friends with the Russians. They won't invade us, you know. But that, of course, is the issue that's been around for a long time. The founders understood it. You know, if we stayed out of Europe, entangling alliances and traded with people, and in spite of all the grief, you know, the president deserves a lot of grief and criticism, but even when he comes along and does something reasonable, you know, even willing to talk to the Iranians and willing to talk to the Cubans, I mean, he gets blasted to kingdom come. But I don't recall, Nixon got some grief, but I don't think he got nearly the grief that Obama got for talking to the Cubans after all those years. But I know we're better off with China, and they're still a violator of human rights, but we're still violators of human rights. We have our prisons overflowing, and I just had somebody call the other day, and they had a son who had a really serious drug problem, and it never committed a violent crime, never injured anybody, but this is his third time. They're concerned he could be put away for life. And if that isn't a violation of putting somebody in prison for a disease, we don't put alcoholics in prison for life because they drink, you know. So it's a real tragedy what's going on.
And you don't have to be a fan of Putin or of Russia to not want to spend billions of dollars defending rich Europeans.
That's right. And pretty soon that'll all end because we're going to run out of the money. We won the Cold War, and it wasn't because a certain president and a certain party really pushed for massive increases in military spending. That had nothing to do with it. It had to do with the bankruptcy of the Soviet system, and they had to back out, and their troops went home. Yes, they're better off now economically, and also they're aggressively protecting their borders. I don't believe they're practicing true aggression where they're taking over new countries, but they have one ally not connected to the Russian government and Russian land, and that's Syria. How's that compared to our 130 countries where we have troops? But, you know, this is risky business. You're not allowed to criticize one's own government because then you're unpatriotic. And I was taught, and I truly believe a true patriot is willing to look at the truth, and if a government and the politicians are doing the wrong thing, that you're willing to say it and try to convince people of what is happening. That, I think, is the important thing to do, is try to get the truth out and explain why non-aggression, non-intervention in foreign policy is just as important as non-intervention in economic policy. And under those conditions, I think that is the path to peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody today for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.